next game, we return to Psygnosis once again with their 4th title in the North American lineup. This one, however, is based on one of their most recognized IPs from the company, and is the 4th title in the series, and that's game number 28, Lemmings 3D, or 3D Lemmings in the rest of the world, and also in the North American game spine, but more on that later. Published by Psygnosis and developed by Clockwork Games. There is no story for this game, but the objectives are clear. You have to clear the route, like digging, putting steps, blocking, and many other features in order to let the lemmings get from point A to point B. Can you do all of it in just one setting and all that? The history of the game is a bit minor, but I want to talk more about the history of the Lemmings, mainly its early beginnings. So with that said, let's talk about it. The origin of the Lemmings series began back in 1984, where a bunch of club members met up at the Kingsway Amateur Computer Club, or KACC for short, in Dundee, Scotland, where they make numerous of small games for home computers, like the Amiga 1000, ZX Spectrum, or Z Spectrum if you're British, or Commodore 64. In those group are 4 founding members, which the names are David Jones, Russell Kay, Steve Hammond, and Mike Daly. Each of them had their own developing techniques and skill set they had, since the group were computer enthusiasts after all. Though at the time they weren't well-known developers since they were newcomers in the gaming industry. However, it all changed when Jones, along with his club friend Tony Smith, started to make their first game called Menace. Though originally called under their working title Cooper Con 1, it was a horizontally scrolling shooter that was similar to one of Konami's arcade scrolling shooters, Salamander or Life Force, depending which country you live in. But despite its similarities, it was completely different due to the complex backgrounds and more detailed designs, which was pretty impressive at the time, since it ran on an Amiga home computer. This caught attention to Psygnosis, a publisher/developer game company located in Liverpool, England, and helped them to publish the game, but also make a contract deal to be part of a subsidiary, which they eventually made the deal. Side note, Jones's development company was originally called Acme Software. However, the name Acme was already taken from a design company, so he had to change the name several times, like Visual Voyage or Elias Smith and Jones. They eventually did come up with the name called DMA Design, which the word DMA was based on an Amiga programming manual called Amiga ROM Kernel Reference Manual Libraries, 3rd edition, in which DMA stood for Direct Memory Access. Though when the company named it, the word DMA had no meaning to it and was just for the company's namesake. When DMA Design's first game, Menace, was released for Amiga in 1988, then a year later for Atari ST, Commodore 64, and MS-DOS in 1989, it was a success and received a positive reception from critics. Like Jason Hallborn of ST/Amiga Format wrote that the game provides some of the best arcade action, which was actually true from critics, reviewers, and consumers, because Salamander, the game that was similar by, did not have a home console version nor home computer version of it, at least in Europe at the time. So seeing this game in store shelves was a no-brainer by gaming consumers who liked Salamander, and immediately getting the game, which sold over 20,000 copies, which in Europe's term is around 20,000 grand. After generated a considerable amount of money from DMA Design, they would make more games as the years follows. Such titles like Ballistix and fictional futuristic sports involving directing a puck to a goal by shooting small balls at it, Blood Money, a side-scrolling shooter that is similar to DMA Design's first game, Menace, but with a different aesthetic and a much more powerful hardware, and the first Shadow of the Beast game, which is an action platformer game, although a development team, Reflections, who would later go on to make the Destruction Derby series as well as the Driver series, did make this game, but DMA Design were tasked to port it to the Commodore 64 and TurboGrafx-16, or PC Engine if you live in Japan. While some of the games were successful in the Europe territories, however, in the North American territories, not so much. Now, if you remembered back in the Nova Storm video, shameless play right in the description below, I said that Psygnosis had a hard time to breach out in the North American video game market because, like every European game companies, they struggled to enter that market, of course. That was until 1991 when DMA Design had an idea of a game that was very interesting and unique compared to their previous titles at the time. It all began somewhere during the late 80s or early 90s when Daily was using a bitmap graphics editor called the Deluxe Paint, which was a programming art tool to use for transparency, colors palettes, animation, and many more. This tool was popular among the home computer developers which used the Deluxe Paint tool at the time and made games out of it. Such examples like Another World, Dark Seed, Eye of the Beholder, The Secret of Monkey Island, and Wolfenstein 3D. Daily was using this tool for making tiny pixel sprite characters as part of a development for DMA Design's next game, Walker. While making the tiny sprite characters for the game, he noticed that these 8 to 10 pixel sprite characters were very interesting and even unique to make when Daily and alongside with Timmons, who was improving the sprite characters when making them. It originally started out as mostly a side thing or a running gag where they made a bunch of animation of these sprite characters, most likely for making a lot of death traps so they could make some silly animations, in quotation marks, because you know, get evaporated, squashed, and getting eaten by some sort of a clown is considered to be funny, if you know what I mean. That was until Kay saw these animations, he observed these sprite characters and said to them, there's a game in that. He then coined termed these sprite characters as Lemmings for these creations, according to Daily. After that, both Daily and Timmons came up with an idea for these lemming characters and decided to make a puzzle strategy video game where the lemmings have to go through from point A to point B while trying to come across through obstacles. And after the idea was shown to Psygnosis and was impressed by this, they decided to greenlit the project and thus began its development. Now, normally I talk about its development cycle of the game from start to finish, however, I'm not going to talk full detail about it, because that is not the game that I'm discussing about in this video. but I am going to save it for another time when I talk about the PS1 port of Lemmings, as well as its expansion pack, which is a compilation game of the first and the expansion pack combined in one part, called Lemmings and Oh No, More Lemmings, which will be discussed in the future. So, if I have to at least say one thing about the development for the first Lemmings game, is that a bunch of key developers were making some of the most challenging levels and even mastered these difficult but yet ingenious levels they have ever made. When the first Lemmings game was released for Amiga in February 14th, 1991, it was an unexpected success and received a lot of praise from casual audiences and gaming critics, which, at the first day of its release, the Amiga version sold over about 55,000 copies, which in comparison, their two past games, Menace, sold about 20,000 copies, and Blood Money sold about 40,000 copies cumulatively. This would soon fall with other home computer versions during 1991 like MS-DOS, Mac OS, Atari ST, ZX Spectrum, Archimedes, and PC-98, which they too became a success, and when it was finally time to release it in North America in 1992, it was just as a success and finally became Psygnosis' first success in the North American video game market. This would be no shock that it would also get home console and handheld ports along the way from 1992 to 1994. There was the NES, Super NES, Game Boy, Master System, Genesis, or Mega Drive if you're British, Game Gear, 3DO, PC Engine CD-ROM, or TurboGrafx-CD if you're American, CDI, and Amiga CD32. Some of the home and handheld ports would become successive, most notably the Nintendo consoles, which these ports, since they're the most recognizable ones, at least in North America. Even so, that Nintendo caught attention to the game and liked the style and friendly look to it, that it even manages to get a front cover in the 37th issue of Nintendo Power, released in June 1992. After its success, DMA Design would make more games in the Lemmings series, like an expansion pack called Oh No, More Lemmings, released the year as the first one in 1991, which contains 100 new levels and 6 new music tracks, and also contains 10 two-player levels if you own an Amiga version of the game. Then, 2 years later, they would make an actual sequel called Lemmings 2: The Tribes, released in 1993, which plays mostly the same as the first and its expansion pack, though the only major difference is that instead of taking place in an underground chamber, it takes place in a very unique environments like jungles, deserts, medieval castles, and more, which would become staples in the following Lemmings games. And then a year later, they would make a third game called All New World of Lemmings, or The Lemmings Chronicles, if you lived in North America, in 1994. Just like the previous two main entries and its expansion pack, it plays the same, but the graphics was a bit of a step up, which includes new texture environments and the updated character designs of the Lemmings. And that's about it. And also, this was the last Lemmings game to be developed from DMA Design and left Psygnosis altogether. Now you may be asking why they left the publisher and the Lemmings series. To most people, they said that the reason they left because Psygnosis got acquired by Sony, which DMA Design did not like and didn't want to be an exclusive to Sony, and so they left the publisher behind. But that was not the case. The real reason why they parted ways with the publisher is because the people who made the first 3 games and its expansion pack were getting a bit tired of making them and just wanted to move on with other projects. With Mike Daly commented that Lemmings 3 was more to end our commitment to Psygnosis than actually do a good game. The larger character size really spoiled it, but it was done like that because we had been approached by the Children's Television Workshop. Yeah, that Children's Television Workshop, who later renamed to Sesame Workshop, who made Sesame Street, who wanted to use the character and the game. They wanted the characters to be bigger, and that really complicated things, and spoiled it. By the end of Lemmings 3, I think we were all ready to move on. And also David Jones also commented that we needed a break for a while after Lemmings, which, spoiler alert, they never made another Lemmings game ever again, with one sort of minor exception, but that's for the conclusion segment, so just wait on that later. 3 years of hell, and thus parted ways with Psygnosis after the release of their 3rd Lemmings game and the Sony acquisition. So, with Psygnosis having no developer behind the wheel, they must act of finding a replacement so they could continue on with their flagship series. So they looked over a bunch of development subsidiaries that Psygnosis acquired during that time. They finally found one and decided to give their flagship series to Clockwork Games, a development studio that is not well known or even well recognized, in a matter of fact that I could not find the history of the company and where it's located at. The only scrap that I could find that they were originally called Lunatic Software, who worked on Necronom and Cytron back in the early 90s, before changing their names to Clockwork Games in the mid-90s, in which 2 years prior, along with Raising Hell Software, later renamed to Bizarre Creations after its release, developed/ported Wiz and Liz to Amiga and Genesis. And that's about it for their beginnings. A bit short, I know. Back on topic, after giving their flagship series to Clockwork Games, they needed to decide of what the next game should be. But for bizarre reasons that they decided their next entry they would go into the 3rd dimension, and thus made the 4th main entry called 3D Lemmings, or Lemmings 3D if you live in the US, which is a very dumb name change because they just put the 3D word at the end instead of the beginning. I never thought the US would change something stupid because that is usually a Europe and Australia thing, if you know what I mean. Unfortunately, there is no information about the game's development history because it is not well remembered and the most forgotten mainline game in the series. But more on that later in the reception and review part. The only thing I could say that it plays like the first Lemmings game, but in 3D, according to Wikipedia. And that's all the research I could find. But fortunately, I did find the names of developers who did work on Lemmings 3D, which I found in the old Psygnosis.org site, which despite being almost 3 decades old, it would still be up without a Wayback Machine as of 2022. Which feels like a time capsule of what the internet was like back in the 90s, which if you want to check it out, I'll send in the link down in the description below. Anyways, back what I was saying, the programming was done by Martin Hall and James Thomas, the 3D modeling was from Rob Matthews, the level design was also by Hall and Thomas, but with Andrew Breachin and Neil Cassini. The manual and packaging test was from Damon Fairclough. The producer was from Greg Duddle. The music manager was from Phil Morris. Both manual illustrators / photos and 2D graphics and animation was also done by Cassini. Original Lemming models was done by Peter Grayley. Public relations was from Mark Selwyn Blewett. And finally, special thanks to Martin Chudley, Kevin Dodds, Marcus Goody, Jen Putnam, Graham Stafford, and Alan Tuck, who took part in the game's development. And another thing I did find are some unused graphics that never appeared in the MS-DOS version that I found from the cutting room floor. Like a very different icon that do look similar to the icons in the first game, but not by much. A Pac-Man theme graphics, which at some point that they were making a level that were references to Namco's Pac-Man, but decided not to use it because they think that Namco won't take too kindly of it and would probably get sued by Psygnosis for ripping off Pac-Man rather than a reference to Namco's flagship series. And last but not least are the credit signs, which most likely would have been used as credits or somewhat. Though the only interesting part about it that it shows a Sony logo and a PlayStation logo. Presumably that the game would be ported to the PlayStation a few months later. But for now, let's get into the reception of the original home computer version right away. Oh wait, I almost forgot the candy company called Jelly Belly was part of the game as an advertisement. Why? Well, I don't know other than it just exists for some reason, but still worth mentioning it, no doubt. When Lemmings 3D for MS-DOS was originally released back in July 31st, 1995, it received some praise by both fans and reviewers, with 3 in particular by GameSpot, Gamer Manager, and PC Gamer US, which the last one commented, "If you love puzzle games, 3D Lemmings should be in your collection." It was also given the Best Puzzle Game of 1995 from PC Gamer US as well. After that, Psygnosis decided to port the game on home consoles, mainly 2, being the Saturn version, which was only exclusive to Europe and Japan only, and the only home console version that the US got is, of course, the PlayStation version. The only 6 main changes that's from this port is the different background levels, the frame rate being a little bit better, the Lemmings sound effects whenever a lemming falls down or gives directions of which way the lemmings are going, the music being different, and the main menu hub layout being completely different, and that is the only major difference between the original and the port. Well, at least that's something, I guess. After months of porting it, when the PlayStation version was released in Europe in September 29th, 1995, which was a launch title in Europe, North America in November 21st, 1995, and Japan in November 8th, 1996, It too was a success and received praise just like the MS-DOS version. Like, the 4 reviewers of Electronic Gaming Monthly scored the PlayStation version an 8 out of 10, citing the outstanding 3D graphics and innovative, complex gameplay. With one of the reviewers, Mark Lefebvre, if I'm pronouncing it right, commented that multiple camera angles, a training mode for new players, and an incredible interface to a very complex game is just a few reasons Lemmings 3D is a winner. And in the first issue of the official UK PlayStation magazine, November 1995 issue, an uncredited reviewer commented, "Love it or hate it, Lemmings 3D is addictive and extremely playable. Not a showcase PlayStation game, but a nice alternative to the norm." However, despite praising the PlayStation port back in its release, there was actually one reviewer who gave it a negative review, and that came from GamePro, who panned the game, contending that the 3D view is confusing and exacerbated by poor controls and excessive menus to navigate through. Though at the time that this was the only negative review, at least to my knowledge, back in its release, due to the obsession with early 3D gaming, but many years later, where the whole 3D craze really don't matter anymore, I think GamePro's review of the PS1 port may have aged like fine wine. Why? Well, I'll get to that in the review part, right now. Except I can't because I still need to go over the reviews for the Saturn port. Don't worry, it won't take that long. It would only just take like a minute. So let's get on to that. When the Saturn version was released, it wasn't well received by fans and reviewers, and considered this to be the worst version of Lemmings 3D. One such reviewer is Rob Allsetter of Sega Saturn magazine, commented that the 3D concept made the gameplay cumbersome and difficult to master. Once you're familiarized yourself with the method, it's a lot less hassle. But there are still those moments when, with only 1 split second left, you find yourself changing a camera angle to actually see what's going on rather than choosing lemming rolls to save them. He also complained the puzzles are highly frustrating but acknowledged. For the more even-tempered among you with craniums the size of the Superdome, this might just fit the bill. Okay, now we're officially done about its history and its reception, and moving straight on to the review of the PlayStation version right now. The graphics are okay at best. Sure, it doesn't look that bad and had some good things to say, like the frame rate runs pretty smoothly because of the version running a bit better than the original MS-DOS version and Saturn version as well. The 2D sprite characters of the Lemmings are well done, and so are the animations too, but they do look pixelated when you see them up close, but still well done overall. The textures, like the walls and objects, being from okay but a bit generic to good and at least a bit decent, and the background are not that bad and pretty good. Well, except for the circus levels, which, yeah, it's not one of their best designed levels, I can tell you that. However, the only bad thing I have to say about is that the graphics can cause texture warping, mainly if you're using a first-person lemming perspective, which you can tell warps the textures when a lemming walks above an object, or turning left or right. And that's about it. The presentation is also okay at best. The cutscenes of the game look fine, though the FMV 3D cutscenes look dated, but I'll give it a pass due that early video game CG was still new at the time and would get better and worse in the coming years. Why both? Well, you just have to wait for a very, very, very long time until we get to those games soon. The only thing I like is the intro cutscenes when one of the lemmings comes out of the computer, but only to realize that the lemming is completely 2D flat, so he finds the 3D button and press it, and now the lemming is 3D. And also the rest, which they accidentally destroyed the computer. The reason why I found this interesting because it indicates the transition from 2D in their previous games to now 3D in this one. I kinda find it neat overall. Now for the game HUD, it shows all of the stuff you need, like moving the camera, what lemmings you need to command, pausing or moving faster, and switching camera position, which is the least useless one out of the hub. And finally, the already mentioned first-person perspective, when by clicking the lemming head icon first, and then click which lemming you pick, and bam, you are now seeing the level you're on in first-person view. Again, it's all neat and whatnot, except the already mentioned texture warping. The music is okay, but a bit limited. If you're playing the original MS-DOS version, the PlayStation/Saturn version, on the other hand, is not that bad and a very decent soundtrack. Yes, there are two very different soundtracks of Lemmings 3D, one with the PC limitation and the other one having more instrumental beats, with the quality and sounds being completely different. Here are some few examples and also a listen to it too. So yeah, the PlayStation/Saturn soundtrack is better, though there are a few selections that are mostly meh to me, but still some good ones as well. And then there are the sound effects, in which the only bad thing I have to say is when a lemming falls down, and dear God, they get very annoying very quickly. It isn't bad enough where one lemming falls down. Imagine hearing this over and over and over and over again in mostly every level by level. It will make you go completely insane. Luckily, there is an option to turn off the sounds, which makes it better so you won't hear the sound effect again, just to point it out. And finally, the gameplay. Okay, so remember that I said that GamePro's review of the PS1 port may have aged like fine wine? Well, I'm not kidding. Although the graphics, presentation, and music are mostly good and meh, but the gameplay, mainly this port, have so many major problems to it. Starting with the controls. It's very odd to use, especially using the mouse control. Now I know this sounds very weird to say because this is a console port to an original computer port which uses the mouse peripheral, but man, this just doesn't feel remotely good to control, especially when you get to the inside maze levels, which for the love of God, you cannot scroll entirely down because it doesn't feature a middle mouse or a wheel button to scroll up or down, since you have to use this bar on the left corner to move up and down, but it doesn't go completely all the way down for some reason. So I have to switch to a regular controller and scroll completely down. This is actually the only level that I had to beat using the regular controller, though it may have been harder to use because of its different control schemes. Now you may be saying, why not use both the mouse and the controller at the same time so it could be much easier, since it had worked once before with Psygnosis' previous title, Discworld. Another shameless plug, I know. But unfortunately, it didn't work, and thus have no choice but to use either the mouse or the controller. What a shame. I know I wasn't expecting Psygnosis to utilize the two control ports, since again, they have done it once. But still, what a pity. Next is the pacing. There are a total of 100 levels, in which are split into 5, and each having 20 levels, which are Training, Fun, Tricky, Taxing, and Mayhem. Beat through all 100, and voila, you beat the game, with a congratulations screen and the end. Now, with that said, you may think that the game would have a good pacing, with the levels being easy and would get difficult in the later levels, right? Well, not exactly. In some easier levels, you would encounter a level that is difficult and would take upon a lot of time before finishing a level, which happens a lot in the first few fun and tricky levels, and which to me kind of kills the pacing due to the levels being a hard time to take. And finally is the fun factor. Now, I don't know the enjoyment of a Lemmings game since I'm very unfamiliar or never even played a Lemmings game before until now, but if I have to pick which game in the series that should not be your first pick, it would have to be this one. Again, to be specific, this port, because my god, it's a painful sloth to beat through the game with nothing to feel any enjoyment to it at all. The only levels I had somewhat enjoyed were the training levels, and if that is the only good part I could somewhat like, then it failed to be enjoyed. And even if they didn't have any levels where you get stuck for a matter of time and all that, you still wouldn't play it because of the already odd controls and the fact that the PlayStation mouse peripheral couldn't even save this port, then it's a massive failure for this port. And also the Saturn port as well, because it is the inferior version, just to point that out again. Well, I am really repeating myself in this video, am I? Anyways, on to the conclusion. The port of the game is not good or even passable. Sure, there are some things that are alright, and the only good thing that this version did better than the original version is the decent soundtrack, which have some good and meh songs, but it comes crashing down when you actually play the game and realize that there is no fun playing it due to the odd controls, a very bad pacing, and lemming falling sound effect that makes you want to mute the game, and the fun factor is non-existent in my own opinion. Now, I am not sure about the original MS-DOS version since I never played that version, but it is mostly alright on its own, despite the fact that it's one of the weakest ones out of the entire Lemmings series. But even with that, it is still better than playing the console ports, because honestly, Psygnosis should have never gotten console ports to this game, and seriously, who would ever want to return to the PS1 and Saturn versions of it? Nobody, that's for sure. Unless if you have nostalgia for these games back then. If you do, then it's fine, but keep it to yourself. So, what happened to the Lemmings series after its release? Well, there was an additional level pack and playable demo called 3D Lemmings Winterland, released in December 1995, exclusively on MS-DOS. It's just 3D Lemmings again, but winter theme, which contains only 6 levels, and that's about it, and nothing else. Oh, and CGR made a video about it a year ago, which I recommend you check that one out after this one. Then, 5 years later, they would release Lemmings Revolution, in the start of a new millennium of 2000, exclusively for Microsoft Windows, which, despite being the second Lemmings game in 3D, it plays similarly to the earlier 2D Lemmings titles, with the one element being the levels are situated on a rotating cylinder, which the word revolution is in the title, and did fare a bit better than their previous title. And finally, there was Lemmings 2006, released in, obviously by the name 2006, which serves as a remake to the original 1991 Lemmings, and the most recent one in the Lemmings series, exclusively for Sony consoles at the time, since Sony was the publisher for this game for PlayStation Portable, PlayStation 2, Europe only, and PlayStation 3 as an PSN exclusive in North America. However, I'm not done with the series yet. There would be 2 other Lemmings games in which would be arrived to the system, both being The Adventure of Lomax in 1996, which is one of the 2 Lemmings spin-off games, the other one being Lemmings Paintball, also in 1996, and Lemmings and Oh No More Lemmings in 1998, which is a compilation of the first and its expansion pack from DMA Design, which I'm going to tackle in the future. As for Clockwork Games, the one who developed 3D Lemmings, they would develop 2 more games until their closer in 2001, which surprisingly are both racing games and would make it to the PlayStation. That being Rush Hour, or Speedster if you're British, in 1997, and Vanishing Point in 2001. Both would also be tackled in the future. Oh, and speaking of DMA Design, like a few seconds ago, after releasing their 3rd Lemmings title and left Psygnosis in 1994, they would start development in early 1995 of a game that originally supposed to be a top-down racing game called Race and Chase, but soon realized a few years later it would become the very first entry in the most recognizable / acclaimed / popular / controversial series ever, Grand Theft Auto in 1997, which would become DMA Design's flagship series and still does to this very day under their new name Rockstar North after the release of GTA 3 in 2001. Which that too would get ports for the system, like the first GTA in 1998 and 3 other titles in 1999, like the expansion pack GTA London 1969, a director's cut to the first GTA, and the sequel to the first GTA 2. All 4 would be tackled in the coming future. And finally, for the publisher, there would be one more title that Psygnosis released for the system in 1995, and possibly saved the best one out of all of them. But that will have to wait until I get to it about 3 games later. So yeah, we're getting there eventually. And now, to close it out. While 3D Lemmings, or Lemmings 3D, isn't the worst 3D game ever in the series, but it is at least the weakest one, and mostly forgotten because of the whole early 3D gimmick at the time. But still an okay title if you're playing it on the MS-DOS port. But the PS1 port, it's just plain bad, and just a poor man's version to the MS-DOS version. But not inferior because the Saturn port takes the crown as the worst version. I would highly recommend that you just avoid playing this port at all time and would just leave it be in the past, never to be mentioned again as a bygone game from a different decade. And with that said and done, I give my official rating a 2 out of 6. Next time on the PlayStation era, I'm going to be talking about Agile Warrior F/111X, or Agile Warrior F111X, a forgotten game that's a flight combat shooter that was published by a company that the people in the 90s would be familiar by the name of Virgin Interactive, which marks their debut for the system in the US, and the soundtrack would be composed, or at the very least, game sound effects, by the once famous legend Tommy Tallarico. Thanks for watching.